Hello, my name is Jason Adrians. Today is 4/20/25, and this is short and long reflexes in the enteric nervous system. This is for my Week 11 digestive system portfolio. So today I'm going to be walking through the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is often overlooked just because it's kind of its own separate entity. And it's its own separate entity because it has so many neurons within the GI tract that it can actually function completely on its own. And that's the reason it's actually called the second brain, because it can operate completely without the cephalic brain or the CNS as a whole. But in order to do this, it has to do a lot of things. It has to regulate movement, it has to regulate enzyme secretion, regulate blood flow, and just digestion as a whole. So it has to push everything through the GI tract and operate it so that so nutrients can be absorbed and so that it doesn't hurt you or harm you at all. And it does this through two main nerve pathways, or nerve plexes. There's the myenteric nerve plexus, which primarily operates the movement of everything, and there's the submucosal nerve plexus, which has two main functions. It doesn't show the nerves within this submucosa on this diagram here, but it does show the glands and the blood vessels, and there is nerves in here, and those nerves innervate these glands and the blood vessels, and when the nerves get a stimulus, they innervate the glands, and those glands will secrete things into the lumen in order to break down the food or to neutralize acidity, or it has a million different jobs, but those glands do secrete things in the lumen to help break down that food ultimately. And then there's also the blood vessels within the submucosa, and that can regulate vasoconstriction or vasodilation, and that can help absorb things in the bloodstream and ultimately how you get nutrients from the food that you're eating. I'll be going into this more. There's the short and long reflexes as well. I'm going to be going into those more on the next two slides. So to get started, there's the short reflexes. And the short reflexes operate entirely within the enteric nervous system. So that means that there's zero intervention from the CNS. There's zero brain function that actually happens here. This is all a local stimuli, and the local stimuli can function everything it needs to do. So just to walk through an example, let's say this is the small intestine. A bolus will come in from the oral side, and the small intestine is naturally in a relaxed state. And then when a bolus comes in, it becomes stretched. And the stretch receptors, there's stretch receptors embedded into the walls of the small intestine. And those stretch receptors detect this distension, or detect the stretch. And with that stretch, they innervate different things in order to help move that bolus from the oral side to the anal side. So there's two primary things that happen on here. There's the circular muscle here, and then there's the longitudinal muscle. And the circular muscle and the longitudinal muscle actually both help with constriction and help with movement, but they operate in opposite ways. It's kind of confusing, but I'll walk through it. There's the circular muscle. So again, the stretch is detected, and it goes to the ascending neurons. And what happens is the ascending, or the excitatory motor neuron, will contract the circular muscle. So it's going to release things in the synapse like acetylcholine and substance P. And that will cause a contraction in the circular muscle. However, the longitudinal muscle here actually operates in a different way than what you think. When the longitudinal muscle contracts, it actually relaxes. The contraction actually opens up the longitudinal muscle, versus a relaxation causes that muscle to kind of constrict on itself. So that's what's going to happen when the stretch receptor is detected, a bolus in the area. It's going to release things like acetylcholine into the circular muscle to elicit a contraction, and then it'll elicit nitrous oxide and things like that to inhibit a contraction from the longitudinal muscle, which actually can be thought of as like a contraction, or like a constriction. even though it is technically a relaxation. And then there's a problem though, because you can't just have a contraction all across this. It needs to be only a certain area, because you want to push this bolus from the oral side to the anal side. So then what happens is this stretch receptor will innervate descending inhibitory motor neurons, and it will basically put things into the synapse of the circular muscle to relax it. So that's going to be nitrous oxide and different things to relax this muscle so that it's not constricting on both sides. Because if you have a constriction on both sides, then the bolus isn't going to go anywhere. So you need to basically constrict the one side and then relax the other side so that it can move along the GI tract. So it's going to the stretch receptor is going to innervate this neuron, and this neuron is going to put things in the synapse so that it can relax the circular muscle. And then the longitudinal muscle, again, works in an opposite way. So you actually want a contraction here, which opens up the longitudinal muscle so that it can push things through. Just to make sure that I hit everything, the short reflexes are entirely, yep. The stimuli are detected by sensory neurons in the gut wall, yep, that's the stretch neurons. And then the signals relayed through interneurons and motor neurons within the ENS to produce a local response, yep. And this allows a gut response, yep. So that's why it's called the short reflex, just because it can operate completely on a local stimuli, and it allows this to respond much more quickly than if it were to go up to the brain and then back down, versus with afferent and efferent nerve pathways. And I'm going to be moving on to the long reflexes in the next slide. So this is now the long reflexes. As I mentioned, there's the short reflexes, and now there's the long reflexes. And long reflexes innervates the CNS, or it involves the CNS as well. This is a little bit more complicated, but with the long reflexes versus the short reflexes detect a local stimuli and then respond to that local stimuli. The long reflex is primarily through things like smell and sight. So, for example, if you smell food, and then there's chemoreceptors in your nose, and those chemoreceptors send a message to the brain, and the brain detects that as food. The brain detects that as food and sends a message down the efferent pathway to the stomach in this example, and the stomach will start producing gastrin and things to break down this food that you're smelling, because you're probably going to eat it when you're smelling it. Or at least when you're smelling it, and if you're hungry, then it's going to start doing things to get digestion ready. Or there's also the long reflex of food has been detected, and then it goes up an afferent pathway, and then it goes back down the efferent pathway to elicit a response. And this is what it basically says over here. Long reflexes involve the central nervous system, and then, yep, sensory information from the gut is sent via afferent pathways. That's up to the brainstem, and then often via the vagus nerve. It processes this stimulus, and then it sends a response back down the efferent pathway, and then they integrate the digestive activity with external cues. So, as I mentioned, like if you're smelling or seeing food, then it can send things down the efferent pathway and then elicit a response from the stomach or the small intestine or whatever it may be. So this is kind of a summary, just in an image here, a summary of what I said in the last two slides. So there's the long reflex pathway and the short reflex pathway, and the short reflex pathway is in red, and then gray is the long reflex pathway. So, for example, this is the long reflex pathway. You're seeing or smelling pizza. That's the external stimuli. It gets detected by a sensory receptor, and then that sensory receptor sends a message to the brain. The brain detects this, basically determines what this sensory receptor is smelling or seeing, and it sends a stimulus to the neurons and submucosal and myenteric plexus. Neurons of submucosal and myenteric plexes. These neurons then elicit a response from smooth muscles or secretory cells, and these smooth muscles will either contract or relax, or there's endocrine secretion from secretory cells or paracrine release, and things will get released into the lumen in order to break down this food that you're smelling. That's the long pathway. Then the short pathway, a local stimuli. So this guy's very distended or bloated, and that's to show that there's a local stimuli there. It's stretching that's stretching the GI tract. Those sensory receptors and neurons detect that stretch. A message gets sent to the inner neurons. That'd be the ascending and descending neurons. Those ascending and descending neurons innervate things on the neurons of the submucosal and mesenteric plexus. Those submucosal and mesenteric plexus, again, help with secretion and movement. So in order to do anything, it has to innervate the smooth muscles and secretory cells, which elicits a response in the GI tract. So there's two different pathways, but they all end up at the same thing, and that's basically what I've been talking about through the past two slides. Just to briefly talk about a clinical thing that can happen with the ENS. Gastroparesis is a disorder where the stomach cannot empty properly, and this is primarily due to a damage in the vagus nerve. And when the vagus nerve is damaged, it innervates the stomach, for example, and it's not sending the signal to empty the stomach. So what can happen with this is the primary symptom is the early satiety, where you just feel full a lot quicker than you should. And the problem with this is, let's say that early satiety happens after only eating 400 calories. After only eating 400 calories. Then malnutrition can start kicking in. And then there's also bloating because the stomach isn't emptying, and that causes abdominal pain. Nausea, vomiting can also occur. And this is all just from the vagus nerve, which is the long reflex within the CNS, and then it innervates the ENS, and this is the clinical significance of something that can happen within the, I guess, both of those pathways, and ultimately cause problems with digestion. Thanks for listening.